Good evening, everyone. If you can just let me know in the chat that you can hear me, once I've got a few confirmations, then we'll get going. Great stuff. Okay, glad to hear it, Pinewood, Car 34. You've got a couple more coming up, so I'll run a session for GCSE Paper 2 at some point, probably next week. So I'll keep you posted with that. Right, so thank you everyone for joining on tonight. For those of you who did submit some answers just a few minutes ago, thank you for doing so. I will try to use some examples here, but today is really going to be about specifically looking at questions which are targeted towards the A-level specification, which the exam boards have published and said, look, this is the areas that we're going to study, which we're going to examine even in tomorrow's paper 1. So we'll look at exam questions, we'll look at generally where how you could improve what you're looking for, and how to write your answer. And I'll break down the things that candidates in the past have done well and what candidates could do better when answering these questions. And the other thing that I want to cover also is that some questions on paper 1, particularly for physical geography, are very repeatable questions. So in preparation for tomorrow, there are a couple of things that we can just look at and say, okay, this is something that was consistently coming up. So we've got to make sure that we absolutely know this, and then we don't have to worry about it as much. There will be variations in the questions. However, generally the themes will be relatively the same. It's just how they will word the questions which easily catches out candidates. So I'll look at that in a bit more depth, look at how you can spot those nuances in the exam paper tomorrow. And then we'll finish off by looking at a 20 marker. We'll look at an example which a student has very kindly shared with us tonight. And we'll look through the answer very, very carefully, look at where this candidate has done well, and if it needs any further improvement specifically or not. And then we'll finish off by the key pointers of what you should be doing in the exam tomorrow, how you should basically attack the questions that you're going to get, break them down so that you all perform to your best capability. And that's really what it's all about. Everybody who is here tonight, I'm sure, is very capable of doing very well, very, very well. It's just about making sure that you approach the paper in the right way, so that you can communicate to the examiner. You really understand what the what you've learned over the last year and a half or 2 years. Okay. In the meantime, make sure that you keep those questions coming in. If you have anything specific to ask, just keep them in the chat. If I don't refer to it immediately, I will try and come back to it, and I'll keep you posted on that. Otherwise, any comments would be appreciated. I might ask you a few questions as we go along, and we'll take it from there. So hopefully it's not blurry for everybody else. And once we have a little bit of confirmation, maybe Tate or I am Sabs, you guys can see the PowerPoint presentation okay? Is it clear or is it blurry? Crystal clear? All right, good stuff. I'm not sure, Maya, what's going on there, but I'm sure if you need to come back, you can quickly log off, log on again. We'll be here, or keep on, and then right at the end, you can replay the video when it comes back again. Right, let's crack on. So, paper 1, physical geography. As I've for most of you, I've already talked to you about what will come up in tomorrow's paper. So I shared these questions with you yesterday, and the first question I came up with was assess the view that social and economic impacts of earthquakes are mainly the result of their magnitude. Now, if you do have your answer in front of you, please just make sure that it's out in front of you. If you don't have it out, take it out because you're going to need it. Okay, because I will break down for you what candidates have written in the past. I'm going to give you a generic overview. You can quickly mark it yourself to make sure that you're on the right tracks. And again, I'll give you a minute or so to ask me any questions that you might have. And if you want me to, I could share a specific answer that maybe one of you have written and sent to me. Okay, so assess the view that socioeconomic impacts of earthquakes are mainly the result of their magnitude. So remember with assess style questions, okay, that one of your paragraphs has to talk about the magnitude. Specifically, this question, you have to talk about whether magnitude is an important factor in the social and economic impacts. And within that paragraph, you may want to talk about a less economically developed country or a more economically developed country, HIC and LIC. And then the second paragraph, you may want to talk about something completely different to magnitude, right? So bear that in mind. With assess questions, it's not just focused on the premise of the question itself, but what other factors may be included in this too, okay? So for your exam tomorrow, make sure that when you are looking at the question, you get an assessed question, whether it's tectonics or coasts or water insecurity or carbon cycle, wherever it might be. Just make sure that if it's specified on a specific thing, cover that up and just imagine that was referring to something completely different. Okay, and that will help you to structure your paragraphs very, very carefully. All right. Now, before you start answering this question, make sure that you highlight the key elements of the question itself, the social and economic impacts. Maybe write down some facts that you already know very, very quickly. It's probably going to work at a minute and a half you have approximately. For those of you who do have extra time, it might be a little bit longer. So you'll be surprised to know that actually you don't need to worry about, you're able to write down thoughts and ideas very, very quickly rather than it taking a long time to happen, right? So within 30 seconds, you could probably write out a few bullet points, which will bring ease to your mind. So make sure you do that. Don't just launch straight into answering the question, because what often will happen is you will just go around a circle, and then eventually you'll start writing something which is relevant to the question itself, but you'll be challenged by it. Okay, so when I did this question, I did have a paragraph on development and another on governance. Yeah, good. Okay, and then compared to that's all right. Good work there. So let's have a look what's gone well generally for students. Okay, so in terms of the strengths for students generally, okay, they tended to talk about different magnitudes and governance levels, as IMSABS has, and levels of development. Okay, so generally this is just done really well by candidates across A-level geography. However, there are areas where they've done less well. So, for example, inaccurate case study detailing, ranging from the magnitude of the event to the social and economic impacts. One of the questions that I get asked the most often by all geography candidates is, "Sir, can't we just make up stats in the exam?" And my answer to that, of course you can. You can make up as much information as you like to. The unfortunate thing for all candidates today is that all the examiners have access to the internet. So if they come across this case study which is being referred to by a candidate, they can simply Google it and find out whether those statistics are true. And this is where a lot of candidates drop a lot of marks, because if you don't have specific detailed knowledge, and it's not about the number of people that have died, because those will vary, particularly in less economically developed countries. Okay, it's more about the dates. It's more about where the event happened. It's I had a candidate a few days ago wrote an answer and referring to the Nepal earthquake, but then didn't from the answer didn't understand or know that the Nepal is actually in the Himalayas itself, and thought that there was volcanic eruptions that happened there. right? So if you write an answer like that in the exam, that's an alarm bell for the examiner, because by A level you should know that that's a destructive plate boundary with no volcanoes, and it is you have the largest mountain range in the world over there, which is continuously active because of movement of tectonic plates between the Indian and the Eurasian plates. So make sure that you know your magnitude, because that's not going to vary generally. There is a specific number. It will be either 7 or 8 on the Richter scale if it's a serious event, and the dates don't change, right? So make sure you know the dates, and they're not just random things that you've plucked out of the air. And obviously for A level, don't get your case studies mixed up. It's so fundamental. It's at GCSE you probably could get away with it, but at A level, you definitely can't. Okay. So good stuff. Right. So for this question, if you talked about magnitudes, if you talked about governance levels, and you talked about levels of development having an influence, then you are certainly on the right tracks. Word of caution for this question is that if you're just talking about magnitude, then you're seriously limiting your ability to communicate to the examiner that you understand the wider implications of tectonic activity. Remember, for all questions in the exam, you're trying to communicate to the examiner your knowledge, but also your understanding of that material. Okay, it's not let's just dump a case study in here, everything that I know about it. It's your application of it that is far more important at A level rather than anything else. So be mindful of that. Okay, right. Any questions about this particular question? If not, we will move on to the next one. Yes, Maya, that came up in 2021. All these questions that we're looking at today came up last year. Yes, of course, Rory. You can definitely talk about the Tohoku earthquake. Absolutely. And for that example, you can talk about the fact that the magnitude is very large. You can talk about that even though Japan had really good systems in place and governance in place, it was not able to mitigate the social and economic impacts of the earthquake itself. So the costs of coming back from an earthquake event are, in terms of economics, it tends to be far greater in developed countries than in developing ones. But certainly the capacity is greater in developed countries rather than developing ones themselves. Generally, Maya, yes, the 4 marker, you'll have 1 mark, 1 mark, 1 mark, something like that, or 1 and 1 and 2 marks, and there will be some sort of table that you might need to fill in, just one box from it, and you may need to do a Spearman's rank correlation coefficient. I doubt that they'll give you a t-test, but it will be pretty straightforward, and they may ask you about the significance of the data, whether it do you agree with the null hypothesis or not. But yeah, those questions are going to be pretty straightforward for you to kind of get on with. If you find those challenging, then just leave those to the last. So do everything else first. Do the questions that you feel more confident with, and then come back and do the maths questions at the end if you feel that your maths is a little bit weaker. Do I have any predicted questions? I'll come back to that, Rahanzi, a bit later on. Okay. All right, next. So, Coast question. This is a resource which was provided in last year's paper. You've got this graph here that's showing the estimated sea level change over the last 140,000 years. And one thing I would suggest you do is, if you get given a graphic, try to annotate it. You've got, if you need to write something on it, you might want to write down anomaly, you might want to write down peak, you might want to write down trough, some things that which will break the information up for you and make it more digestible. Especially when you're under time conditions, seeing things which you've never seen before can catch you out. But actually, really most of the time with geography anyway, you're looking for trends. You're looking for something which is high, something which is low, something which stands out, which doesn't make sense, right? So just write those things down, and it'll probably help you decipher the information that's in there. The other thing I'd like to say here for these sort of questions in particular is that it says study figure 3a, right? Now, if the exam is asking you to study a figure, then you must use the figure in your answer. Okay? There is some slight leeway with most mark schemes, but predominantly the candidates that tend to do very well are able to use the resource, i.e., lift data from it, extrapolate, and explain what's going on using their knowledge. Okay? And that's what you've really got to do here. Okay? Uh, and that's really going to distinguish you getting 3 marks, which probably every single person in this room could, and not use the resource itself, okay? But it's actually the application of using what you have that will get you the top band marks. Yeah, certainly. I think definitely this is a more challenging question because essentially you're being asked to just decipher information very quick. Right, next. So let's have a look at some of the strengths and the pitfalls here. So strengths for candidates, particularly here, is that you've got secure knowledge of understanding of how sea level rise would form coastlines of submergence, such as Dalmatian coastlines, Oreas, and fjords. But actually, what happened was most candidates were, not explaining how isostatic process could influence the development of contemporary landscapes. So that and these were in conjunction with the rising sea levels shown in the resource itself. Okay, so this is really important. Remember here in this question it says explain how. Okay, and Maya, you can apply this to glaciation. I know this is not a glaciation question here, but it's essentially the same thing, right? So explain how, and then you can replace this with a glaciation issue. Okay, how changes in glacial movement, perhaps, or glacial extent, for example, have produced different landforms. Okay, so here a lot of students not explaining how the process could influence the creation of these particular coastlines, because the question itself says explain how, right? And what students tend to do is just say, you know, this is what's happened. This is the feature that's been created, a Dalmatian coastline or a fjord, but they don't actually go through the process itself. Right. Next question. Again, another resource question, and it's very likely for glaciation and for coasts. Well, it's almost inevitable, not likely, that you will get a resource that you'll have to look at. Remember, again, if they're asking you to study the resource, use the resource in your answer. Okay, so in this case, make sure that you refer to the Summer Beach profile, or maybe even use the data that they've given you to elaborate or explain a key point for this question. The great thing about both the glacial topics and the coast topic is that you just need to know processes. You just need to understand what the processes are, and just apply that information knowledge that you already know. So if I was to ask anyone here, explain the differences in characteristics, what were the first things, geographic terms that will come to your mind that you would want to use for this question itself? Let's have a few of you punch in a few of your ideas, just to see that we're on the right sort of things. And Maya, you can punch in a few things about certainly for glaciers. You can talk about the differences between summer and winter, because glaciers are certainly moving all the time. So I'll give you guys 30 seconds if you pop in some ideas of geographical terms that you know. Yep, good. Destructive, constructive waves, certainly. Come on, I know there's more of you who can say stuff. Berms, yep. Glaciers have a lot more meltwater, that's right, and faster movement, certainly. Yep, neap tides, spring tides, swash, backwash. Yeah, good. So make sure that you're using these key terms, okay, in your answers. Certainly for A-level, swash and backwash will be the minimum standard that would be required, okay? And then obviously talking in depth about the types of waves and how they approach a coastline are going to be important too. Right, let's have a look at what the examiner was looking for. Right, so in terms of the differences, the top level marks tended to go to those who recognize not only to explain the differences between the beach profiles, but also the difference in sediment profiles. Now, which brings me to a very key point here. This is something that comes up all the time in coasts. Every single year since the first iteration of this exam, this specification, there's always been something on sediment profiles. And I've been teaching long enough to tell you that in the old specifications, regardless of whether you were doing OCR, EDUCAS, AQA, or EdExcel, all of them required students to understand the importance or the role of sediment, okay, for coasts. This is the basic level of knowledge that you need to have for coasts, okay? So if you're not comfortable with coasts in terms of you don't understand what sediment cells are, don't understand what sediment profiles are, don't understand the role of sediment in the creation of landforms, you should definitely revise that tonight, okay? Right. The other thing is that many candidates were able to explain the role of wave type in influencing the beach profile. Candidates were not disadvantaged if they used the standard A-level textbook or sophisticated university textbook explanations. And generally that tends to vary between students, okay? But yes. James, I thought that summer beach profiles are steeper, but the question says the opposite. At least that's what it said in the textbook due to summer swell. Right. I wouldn't worry about that, James, because if that's what it said in your textbook, it will be the examiner will be aware of it, and they will credit you for the response that you wrote. So don't worry about that. Of course, there's also different types of coastlines, and beach profiles vary depending on the nearshore, particularly along coastlines themselves. Not being disadvantaged, in the sense that whilst it might be in some coastlines, it may not be accurate information, right? You might not get steeper profiles. And so therefore, the examiner's not going to, not in the sense of marking you down, they're not going to not give you any marks. They will try to give you marks as long as what you've communicated is there is clear understanding being shown. Okay, so you'll get credited for having a flow of understanding which makes sense as it goes along. That's with all the answers with the questions at A-level. It's more about your application of the knowledge that you do have, because it will vary in different places. Okay, good. So again, with coast, the beauty is just know your processes and your landforms. Process, landform. Process, landform. Okay, if you know those two things and you're able to describe them, you will consistently get high-level marks in the exam itself. Right. Coastal landscapes question, right? So evaluate the view that coastal management policies are mainly based on economic judgments. Back to what I was saying earlier regarding longer answer questions, 12 markers, 20 markers in particular. Make sure that you give yourself some breathing space here, right? So make sure you highlight the keywords in the question. So certainly you need to evaluate. So you could be looking at some pros and some cons. And the key thing is that you're going to come to a judgment at the end to say, to a large extent, one issue or one thing is more responsible than something else. Okay. So be aware of that. So the coastal management policies here, I would highlight that or underline it, whatever is easier for you. make sure that you annotate here some examples of soft engineering, okay, the differences between the two. Maybe you might want to write down some statistics about how expensive they are. Groins are going to be less expensive than sea walls, but sea walls are more effective at you know repelling coastal erosion than groins are. Maintenance is a lot higher in groins, so those are things that you should be. They'll be probably swirling around in your head. Just write them down so that you have a clear idea of where you're going to go, and also make sure that you write down some case studies that you might know. Most common ones that are used are going to be Haysborough. So if you've used that in your answers before, or the ones that you submitted to me, then well done. I'm going to go through an answer in a minute. So we will break down and see what a good answer looks like. So strengths for many students. So for many students, they could explain the role of economic factors. And I would say that a good proportion, maybe 70, 80% of will do this very, very well. And in particular, the use of cost benefit analysis to determine whether a coastal management, you know, is the strategy is appropriate or not. There are also good answers about examine the role of social and environmental factors. So remember that in all 12 markers and 20 markers, you don't want to just spend your time just talking about the premise of the question. You want to talk about something which is different. So here, you might want to cover up economic judgments and write down, I don't know, environmental judgment or social judgment. And for most students, they tend to use Holderness, and as I said, Haysborough is a very common one that gets used to. And I think that's in your textbooks, but I might be wrong. Okay, so so there are some candidates who wrote inaccurate accounts of their case studies, particularly for Holderness coasts, and it's common. Students get mixed up between Haysborough and Holderness and Chesil or wherever it might be. So again, the key point to remember is that you must demonstrate accurate and relevant geographic knowledge throughout, right? So if you're getting something a bit mixed up, it will have an impact on whether you do hit the 16 to 20 mark band. And again, the same thing can be applied to glaciers too, in terms of what the specification will be requiring. Right, so let's have a look at an answer here that a student has kindly emailed in, and we'll see how they've written their answer, and we'll try to break down and see what went well and if it requires further improvement. Oops, let me just refresh the screen for you. Okay, yeah, sorry. I have an answer for the next question, the water cycle question. So sorry, I'll come back to that at the end. Right, so coastal landscapes we've done, so let's move on to carbon cycle. Okay, so explain the geological processes that influence the levels of carbon in the atmosphere. Okay, so this question, let's have a look at what you guys came up with. If you could just write down some of the ideas that you had, if you can punch them into the chat, see what you thought was a good answer. So I'm Sabs, you seem to be doing really well, or Rohan. You guys seem to have smashed these questions, so why don't you share with us some of your thoughts? What did you write for this question? And if I teach you, then I'd like to hear from you too. Just quick ideas. What kind of things do you think you might write for this question? Okay, so lots of different ideas here. Thank you for sharing, everyone. So people writing volcanoes, permafrost, got outgassing, wildfires. Again, Tom, volcanic outgassing, diagenesis. Of course, we know what that all means. So I'm Subs, just very quickly for the benefit of everyone else, if you can just let us know what diagenesis is. Sedimentation and chemical weathering of rocks. Right. So the question, very, very quickly, is saying explain the geological processes that influence the levels of carbon in the atmosphere, right? So geological is not going to be biological, right? So if you're writing about biological things or chemical things, that might not be relevant for this question. And therefore, that could limit how well you might do in this question itself. So those little things, thank you, IMSADS, those little things are going to be very important here. And this is what kind of just separates candidates, right? So in the previous questions, the coastal, glacial or glaciology questions, generally students will have their processes and landforms down. But then the little nuances when it comes to the carbon cycle, that's where they'll kind of falter because they're trying to think of all the things that could possibly be correct for this answer. So generally, this is a less well done question, right? So the question is generally found challenging by many candidates, although some recognize the word geological and wrote about the process of venting, outgassing, and weathering. You would have been fine with those three things. But do not write about biological processes or photosynthesis, which thankfully no one mentioned here. So it sounds like you guys are all going to be top band. Or various carbon pumps that exist in the ocean. Uh, although you could talk about it in the exam through the process of lithification, then then that would be okay because you're trying to demonstrate to the examiner that you do have a deeper understanding of things, and they may credit you for that. What would be a good answer for this? Well, I think there's lots of different answers. I'll see if I can pick out one a little bit later on, which I can share with you. Let me see if I can just quickly dig out a quick, nice answer for you to have a look at, Rohan. Just give me about 2 minutes. In the meantime, any questions? Post them in the chat while I try to dig out something here. Okay, so I've dug out a couple of answers, but no perfect answer here. So I'm not going to share anything from a candidate point of view, but I will very briefly share with you a mark scheme which kind of breaks down the kind of things that you should talk about for this answer. So just give me another 30 seconds and I'll be with you. Okay, so let's have a look at the mark scheme. So lots of different things here to be aware of. At the long-term geological cycle, variety of processes, carbon takes place in between 100 to 200 million years. So it takes time to move between rock, soil, ocean, and atmosphere. The specification lists two key processes, volcanic outgassing and chemical weathering. So if in your answer you did talk about either of these things, then you would be well on your way to getting 6 marks. So volcanic outgassing is where carbon is emitted into the atmosphere and the ocean through a process of outgassing, and this is where CO2 that is contained in the mantle fluids is vented from terrestrial stores of carbon. You could also talked about subduction zones and how subducted areas, carbon sources such as kerogen, coal, petroleum, oil shale, and so forth, are oxidated into CO2 and then vented back into oceans or the atmosphere. CO2 also enters the atmosphere through continental rift zones at divergent plate margins. So you can talk about that, and that you've got CO2 vented at hotspots and currently non-erupting volcanoes such as Yellowstone, where CO2 passively diffuses into the atmosphere. And for those of you who've been to Yellowstone, you'll know that for sure. Chemical weathering of rocks. Atmospheric carbon combines with precipitation to form weak carbonic acid, which then reacts with rocks to form carbonates, which are carried by rivers to oceans, as well as subaerial processes, which contribute to the carbonates in the oceans. And you could also talk about the marine organisms that are sequestering this in shell. So when they basically die and then they kind of drop to the bottom of the ocean, that will add to it. There will also be long-term processes involved in long-term geological cycles, such as creation of biological sedimentary rocks through the process of lithification. I think you've even just briefly talked about lithification. That would certainly demonstrate to the examiner that you have a deeper understanding about the topic, and also perhaps talking about the direct process of direct precipitation of calcium carbonate from marine or fresh water. Do you have to talk about all these things? The answer is no. I would say probably 2 bullet points from this list, well explained, will get you well on to your, 4 to 6 marks. Okay, so hopefully that's useful. As always, guys, if you have any questions as you're going along, not sure about something, just ask. Okay, next. So explain why changes in health may threaten people's well-being. Right, so let's have some thoughts. Pop them into the chat, and let's see what you guys can come up with before we break down and see what candidates actually wrote. decrease in food security, increasing ocean temperatures, coral bleaching, which threatens coral communities in Kiribati, like barrier reefs, tourism, coral bleaching. Yep, tourism coming up again and again. Increase acidity, leading to difficulties with desalination, and has become more energy demanding. Okay, I'm not sure what you're referring to. That I'm Sabs, but I'm sure it's on the right tracks. Right, let's see what's the examiner said about that. Oh wait, did we? Yeah, we've done this, haven't we? We went through the yeah. There we go. Sorry. Thanks, Tom. Right. So explain why the ocean health may threaten people's well-being. So strengthening good answers. Examine the range of ocean health through acidity, salinity, and temperature, which most of you are talking about anyway. The best answers noted that in developed countries, the impacts may be less significant than in developing countries, and as a result of the dependence on the latter on marine resources for their livelihood. So, yeah, absolutely everyone's saying in here is correct, but remember for these sort of questions, you just need to qualify it with maybe an example that you're aware of and show the differences between places, because that's essentially what geography is all about. Now, I'm going to show you a answer that someone's written, and I would like you to read it and tell me what you think this candidate should get. And if this candidate is in the room, thank you for sharing. You don't have to let anyone know. And let me know your thoughts. What has gone well for this answer? What you think may need further improvement in the chat. Give you guys 2 minutes. Okay, for most people going for a top band sort of answer, maybe 4 or 5, almost hitting top band. So let's read through it. Decline in ocean health has 2 main effects on people's well-being. It affects food supply chains and economic because of decline in tourism and fish farming. It's a very good start to an answer because it establishes the key things that will be discussed in the rest of the answer itself. Okay, so this is often less well done by candidates across the board. So if you're writing like this, the examiner's probably perked up and thought, yeah, this is good. Okay. Right. So The decline in ocean health as a result of acidification and bleaching is having an effect on marine food webs, causing both fish and crustacean stocks to decline. It's a valid point to make. This is beginning to largely affect people's well-being, as fish are a main source of protein for an estimated 500 million people worldwide. This is also affecting the incomes of millions of families who rely on fishing for income. So in this paragraph, the candidates certainly talked about acidification and bleaching being an issue, talked about how many people are affected by lower fish stocks. I think here, whilst this is generally a great paragraph because it's talking about the impact, it needs to be narrowed down to a specific place and how people might locally be affected by it. Maybe some statistics around that would be really helpful. Another decline in well-being is due to the decline in income from tourism industry. A valid point to make. This is because the declining ocean health is causing coral reef degradation, which has attracted many tourists to the areas such as the Caribbean and Australia. What would be even better here is if the candidate talked about how many tourists have perhaps come here in the past. This has led to the decline of the scuba diving industry, which is again a valid point to make, but then qualify that by giving a specific statistic or piece of information, data, which will then show the examiner that you truly know the ins and outs of the issues surrounding it. So again, that third paragraph, absolutely valid points being made throughout. Would I give this 8 out of 8? Probably not. Probably you're looking at least 5 out of 8. And if an examiner is being generous, might give you 6 or 7. 7, I think, would be too far up. So remember, for these sort of questions, 8 marks in particular, you want to pick out salient points from the case studies that you've looked at and write about them in your answer itself. Yeah, a good question, I am sad. I guess you can email them to me at my email address, obviously. Let's have a look here. You can email them to this account. All right, put it in the chat. Can I put it in the chat here? Let me see. Do I have access to my own chat? Here we go. I don't know if you guys got that. But yeah, the email address is ecademyonline1@gmail.com. So if you want to write that down, ecademyonline1@gmail.com, email it to me and I can have a look at your answers for paper 2 or even paper 3, which we'll review at a later time. Right, let's look at what else you could have written for this answer very, very quickly. So we've looked at this answer here. So here's something that you could have written for the tourism aspect of this question. So coral reefs generate over $36 billion in global tourism value every year, essentially raising over revenue for over 70 countries, which have multi-million-dollar reefs that generate approximately $1 million per square kilometer. The great thing about that paragraph is it's got economic data, but it's also qualifying it in a local but also global sphere. These reefs are generating jobs, creating critical foreign exchange earnings for small island developing states that have very few alternative sources of employment. This is through in-water activities such as diving and glass-bottomed boat trips, and reef-adjacent values such as calm, clear waters, stunning views, beautiful beaches. The Maldives are reliant on this. 22.7% of this comes from is of their GDP, like Jin mentioned, and attracts over 1.6 million visitors. So again, if you just wrote that in the exam, you wouldn't get 4 marks. But this is just to give you an idea of the sorts of things that you should be writing for that. Right, next, water cycle. Assess the impacts of climate change on the flows or processes in the hydrological cycle. So I'd just like you to just review your answer very, very carefully. Just give you 30 seconds if you want to punch in some ideas into the chat, and then let's go through and see what the examiner has to say about this. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the things that you're mentioning. Infiltration, surface runoff, desertification, evapotranspiration changing, climate change, increased thawing of permafrost, feedback loops, accelerated by deforestation, potentially less interception by vegetation. Okay, let's have a look what the examiner is looking for. Very few candidates were able to develop their answers with an assessment of the impact, and few had convincing cases of case study material beyond some areas in the world would be wetter and some would be drier. So, many candidates explained rather than assessing the point or points, and many explanations of the impacts of climate change on the flows of hydrological cycle showed good knowledge and understanding. So it's very important, particularly here, that you've learnt that you need to learn recorded recent changes to precipitation as well as the predicted changes to both precipitation and evaporation. And the Met Office obviously published this information, and they themselves say that warming has increased by, well, will increase by 3 degrees centigrade by the year 2070, and may increase by 3.5 times more, and in terms of the number of intense rainstorms that might happen of more than 30 millimeters a day. So again, what you were all saying here in the chat regarding increased, precipitation, evapotranspiration, these are all great things to write in the exam. However, if you are not qualifying those points with data or information which, gives concrete evidence for what the point that you're trying to make, then you're not going to hit top band for this question itself. Okay. Remember, for A-level geography, if impacts are being asked about something, inexorably you're going to need data to back up your point. And all of you, I'm sure every single person in this room, can very easily write about evapotranspiration and rainfall increasing. But I think very few of you, perhaps I could be wrong, very few of you will remember specific data. So if you don't know that, you got tonight to quickly have a look through your notes and make sure that you've learned some data, which will help you to write. Remember, all these questions that I popped in here are actually have a potential of coming up in the exam because you have a reduced spec. So I haven't put these questions in, and they're not going to come up tomorrow, Friday, whenever the exam is. This is stuff that you need to know, essentially. Okay. So in terms of the mark scheme, these are some of the things for AO2 for you to get into the top. If you want to get the high level marks, all the things that you were mentioning before in the chat were all AO1 sort of things. Okay, so your exam is on Friday. Cool. So these are all the things that we've just discussed previously in the chat here have all been AO1 things. That those are things that everyone writes about. But these are some of the things that you can write about that will take you to a higher level. Okay, so for example, the key consequence of this increase in water vapor is to increase the intense precipitation, leading to changes in river regimes as well as surface runoff. And so stream flows such as in equatorial Africa may increase. You might have large increases in temperatures in the Arctic, and that will lead to a lot of water vapor being held in higher latitude areas, and so might lead to increased levels of precipitation in those regions. But you could also argue that yet other areas will see a reduction in precipitation levels and evapotranspiration. We'll see a reduction in stores such as soil moisture and groundwater, leading to more droughts in areas such as Spain. So these are, again, these are things which you elaborate upon and expand upon, which higher order candidates will certainly do for this. Okay, good. Let's move on to the next question. Evaluate the view that most transboundary water conflicts are impossible to solve. Okay, so many the strengths here were that many good answers which identified and explained water conflicts in the Nile, the Mekong, and the Middle East. So all of you are aware that those are case studies, which specifically I think the exam board have said that most candidates will know about, and you must know for your exam that's coming up. Okay, so just be aware of it. You need to make sure that you have that locked down. The best answers evaluated the extent. So remember, for evaluation questions, you've got to say at the end, to a large extent or to a small extent, X or Y factor has a greater influence than the other, despite or for reasons such as whatever it might be. So you examine the success of the Mekong River Commission as well as the water sharing treaties in the rivers Colorado and the Nile. And some compare the effectiveness of those treaties, right? So particularly with the Nile Water Treaty, which was established during colonial times, now is being challenged by other countries, which are feeder countries of the Nile. They are taking a different approach to these treaties, and in some cases are moving away from it, which is going to create particularly big issues for countries such as Egypt, who are going to certainly lose out the most in this whole process. So in terms of an answer, let's have a look at this. Candidate shared very kindly. Let's have a read of this answer together and try to understand whether um, they are on the right tracks in terms of their structure, or whether there needs to be any improvements. I'll give you just a minute or two. I'll give you the entire answer. There's another slide after this, and there will be a little bit cut off at the end when it comes to conclusion, but that's fine. We don't need to worry about that. We should get a good gist of this answer before then. This is a mean question. Well, that's the challenge. That is the challenge available, right? So you've got to just make sure that you know your case studies, but the key thing is that you're critically analyzing that information that you do know, so that the examiner can understand that you really truly understand the information, not just copying and pasting case study information in. Rahanzi, yeah, definitely. This video will be available as soon as this call finishes tonight, so you can come back and watch this whenever you like. Very funny, Tom. Okay, so the first thing that I'd like to do is for this first paragraph, can someone tell me what is going well in the first paragraph itself? Just some thoughts about it, please. What is going really well in this introductory paragraph? Thanks, Tom. Anything else that's going well for the introductory paragraph? Anyone else want to chip in? Okay, so I think the key thing here is that the opening paragraph really sets the premise for the rest of your answer. Okay, there's lots of different ways of doing this, but how you do it will determine your uh, how much strength you have of understanding of the topic itself. Okay, so this candidate, as they've written out their answer, the first few lines, is establishing the complexity of the issue at hand. Okay, and uses really, really good um, terms throughout. Okay, he's talking about obviously starting off with key term transboundary, talking about mutual, talking about stakeholders, talking about actually how they influence things, but also there are some cases where this is not the case, right? So in a very few lines, actually they've said a lot very, very quickly, right? And that can only happen if you really understand the topic already. Okay. So, in terms, remember that the examiner is looking for understanding, not just simple, this is the River Nile, you know, this is creates this much economy for Egypt, and this is how much it will create for Ethiopia. No, it's talking about what are the issues, who's involved, is it local, is it national, is it international, what are the disputes, can they be resolved? Yes, no, whatever it might be. Okay. So that's a really, really strong way to start. And then goes on to looking at an example of the Nile Basin. So currently having 300 million people, yet is expected to double to 600 million by 2030, which is only a few years down the road, while water scarcity is less than 1,000 meters per squared. So again, giving data to validate that point is not presently a widespread issue for the nations in the Nile Basin. Growing populations and agricultural demands pose a threat to tipping some countries into that category. So evaluating as the candidates writing this answer. As a result, governments are likely to have more aggressive approaches when it comes to securing water supplies. Now, that the ending of that paragraph could be improved further by validating or giving an example of what aggressive approach actually means. Does that mean negotiation through diplomacy, or does that through, you know, a military intervention, for example? Even just a brief mention of what aggressive approach is would be a perfect ending to a very, very good paragraph nonetheless. Okay. So already as someone's, reading through this answer, they've got a good understanding that this candidate has a strong foundational knowledge, but also has greater evaluative knowledge about the topic at hand. Let's carry on. So, as well as eliminating the nation's water scarcity at risk, there is very serious potential for conflicts to break out between Ethiopia and countries such as Egypt further downstream. Depending on how quickly Ethiopia fills the dam, will determine the downstream flow that Egypt receives. So here, the candidate is talking about some temporality. So there's a timescale issue here. So over time, the situation is going to get worse. It would be better if there was some mention of that, but it's pretty clear through the description that that's what's being referred to. Conflict will likely arise if Ethiopia prioritizes its own socioeconomic development by rapidly filling up the dam, as opposed to letting Egypt have its fair share. Now, actually, we do know that Ethiopia is trying to do that very, very quickly, and that certainly will have an impact. So again, that would be information which you may or may not have access to, but the ending of the paragraph is good nonetheless. However, so going on to the other point of view, transboundary water conflicts can be solved or avoided altogether. The Nile Basin Initiative aims to allocate equitable use and ownership over the Nile's water, with 9 of the 10 Nile Basin countries exploring the NBI since 2005. There is hope that all riparian states will get their fair share of the Nile. So good. So it's balancing out counter argument, saying that there is initiatives that are going on, diplomatic ones, which will help to reduce the tensions and give everyone a more equitable access to that water supply. In addition, the Syr River in Central Asia sparked disputes between Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, all need for more water. for summer irrigation, but Tajikistan had diverted it. In response, Kazakhstan generated a restoration policy which aided transboundary cooperation and resolved the large majority of conflict. So again, the question is asking you, are conflicts impossible to solve? Well, actually, no, they're not. Here's a good example of it. This is what's happened. This is what was done, and today this is the consequence of it. And then conclusion: it is necessary to note that transboundary water conflicts are never black and white. What an excellent way to evaluate at the end, to show that things are not just one spectrum or the other, but actually that there is a very large grey area when it comes to this. And reaching an outcome that meets the stakeholders' demands is not always feasible. However, if affected countries address the matter with civil diplomacy, it is not beyond reach, and so forth. And Canada ends with the conclusion. So overall, remember that the examiner is not going to look at paragraphs alone or sentences alone. They're going to look at the whole answer from start to finish. How well does it flow? What is the contextualization of what they're saying? At the end of each paragraph, are they referring back to the question itself? Are they saying, okay, look, actually they are solvable, or no, they're not solvable, right? And then qualifying it with an example. So in terms of the structure of the answer as it's going along, this is a very strong answer all the way through, and probably would be in the top band category for top marks, so 16 to 20 for sure. And there's no reason why you can't do the same. I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail in a minute with regards to how to write your answers. But really, for the 12 markers and the 20 markers, when you go and do the exam, please make sure, okay, when you are writing your paragraphs, that you spend at the end of that paragraph, that 20-marker paragraph that you've written, look back at the question and say, okay, have I answered this question? How have I answered this question? Right? Did I give pertinent details? Have I evaluated? Have I come to a judgment at the end of my paragraph that relates back to the original question? Okay. Have I given evidence for and against, or just for? And does that help to answer the question or not? Words like to a large extent, to a small extent, okay, yet, despite, are going to be really good to use because it helps show your authority over the topic itself. Right, next. Now I want to come back to some coast stuff, which I mentioned earlier. So this was a video that I made a few weeks ago, which is available. You can watch this in your own time. I will go through this in a little bit more detail now. Explain the role of sediment transport. I mentioned earlier that this is something that comes up again and again. Here's how it comes up again and again. Right, so 2021, explain the differences between characteristics of beach over time in the summer and the winter. Again, you can just substitute the words for glaciation and you'll get the same sort of thing. Explain the role of sediment transport in the development of coastal landscapes, 6 marks. 2019, explain the contribution of coastal deposition to development of this landscape, 6 marks. Same question. Explain the role of sediment transport in distinctive landforms, 8 marks. Same question. Explain how sediment cell concept contributes to understanding of coastal systems. I think probably if it was going to come up, if I'm predicting, inverted commas here, then they might ask you something about sediment cells, right? But remember that every single time that they're asking you about coastal landscapes, if they're asking about coasts, they're asking you to describe the process and the landform. Process, landform, okay? It's just how they word it will throw you off, okay? Don't be thrown off. Just make sure. Always remember, if the word sediment comes in your question, okay, or is being inferred on, as it was in 2021, okay, that you've got to talk about the processes that are involved and how they end up with specific landforms. And this is where candidates will fall, because they will talk a lot about longshore drift. They're very good at talking about longshore drift and swash and backwash and prevailing winds and so forth. But what they will miss out is talking about the actual landforms that are created in the process of that. So in this case, again, this slide is on the other video, and I'll go into to a lot more detail. I won't do that here, but remember that you understand what sediment transport is, to traction, siltation, suspension, solution, okay, and what landforms they create, so beaches, tombolos, spits, cuspate forelands, and so forth, and the role that they, what role do they take in the creation of that landform. But also remember keywords, key terms like sediment cells, swash, backwash, longshore drift, which I'm pretty sure everyone in this room tonight is going to refer to. Inputs, outputs, transfers, currents, tides. Those words are generally less well used. Okay, so make sure that you have those geographical terminologies in your arsenal to help you to write very well qualified answers. Okay, so use words swash and backwash, use inputs and outputs when you are referring to your answers consistently throughout. Again, go back to the previous video because I actually give you specific examples of answers which you can look at. Good answers, not so good answers, and what you should do to write good answers for these sort of questions. So to wrap up for today, a couple of things, final recommendations, and you must take these into account. Highlight the keywords in the question before you start answering them. I know this sounds really basic, and you'll be surprised how many people, even though I've said this, innumerable number of times, just do it, okay? And then make sure that you annotate the questions before you start answering them. It is just psychologically better for you. You've got it down on a piece of paper. You can refer to it rather than storing all that information in your mind. Exams are by nature a stressful situation to be in. You're being timed. There's a clock at the front. Someone's going to be walking up and down the aisle. Someone's going to be, maybe something could happen. Okay, you're going to be in a state of stress regardless. Okay, so make sure that you give your mind that breathing space to be able to write really well qualified answers, as you've seen in some examples today. For the 12 and 20 markers, make sure that you review at the end of each paragraph and think, how is this answering the question? Am I actually did I use the keywords? Did I use swash and backwash? Did I use data? Did I refer to a specific statistic? Did I use a case study? Did I make sure that my dates are correct? Did I refer to the correct magnitude of the event? Okay, don't merge your case studies together, which sometimes happens. For 6 markers, but you can apply this for 12 and 20 markers too, or 8 markers too. Use the words because, despite, some, but. Okay, you've got to use these words, right? Again, it gives you that balance, particularly despite, right? So if you're writing an evaluation question, okay, and you can say, 1 point, and then you put the word despite in, and then it's basically a segue for you to then counter that argument that you have said, instead of saying, on the other hand, right, which is so boring that so many people write. Don't write that, just write despite. Boom, you've got one word, and then you can segue into the other point that you want to make. Done. Okay, right. Use case study material to demonstrate the point you are emphasizing. Okay, it's not about just plastering case studies into your answers. It's about using them to help you to communicate understanding to the examiner. Okay, so make sure that when you are writing it, that you refer to it properly. Okay, short answer questions, typically about 100 words, no more than that. It's about a paragraph, just a little bit over. Write in third person, for example. The most critical factor appears to be, do not start your answers with, I completely agree. I think this is the correct thing, or I completely disagree. All right. Avoid like the plague. Do not write those words. Okay. The word I shouldn't be in the sentence. The words I completely agree should never be used. Okay. You need to make sure that for evaluation that you're in the gray area. Okay. You're saying that to a small extent, okay, or to a large extent. These are the reasons for why this factor seems to be more important than this factor, despite the fact that this is happening. Okay, and if you go back to the previous video that I did, there are some really good examples of how to write those answers. So make sure that you do that. Okay, right. So write as if the person who's reading your answer, is getting the sense of authority, right? So you saw in the water cycle question that we just looked at the answer, that is an example of a candidate writing with authority. Okay, so try to emulate that and try to write like that. And a final point here really is that write clearly and neatly. It's it. I know it's stressful in the exam, but remember, you've got more time than there are number of marks, right? So you're looking at a minute and a half or so, or 2 minutes. But give yourself that space and time. You'll be surprised how much you can write in a very short period of time. Just make sure you plan out your answer, because then if you're planning it out before you start writing, you're more likely to write a little bit slower, more effective writing, and it will be a lot more clearer. If you find yourself answering, this may or may not be you, but you go into the exam, you sit down, you open the question, you go, "Oh yeah, I know that. I'm gonna smash this question," right? If you write something out and then you say, "Yeah, I've murked that, right? I've smashed that," then you should really critically think about that, because likelihood is you probably haven't. Okay? If you feel something's going really easy, it's not going well. All right? That's what you should be thinking in the exam. All right? So please make sure that if you're finding things a breeze, something's not going right. Have you used your geographical terms? Have you used case study material? Have you applied data? Did you use the figure from the data that they gave you, or the graph or the chart, or wherever they gave you the photograph? When they said study, X figure, whatever it might be, did you refer to it in your answer? Because if you didn't, there's your alarm bell should be ringing straight away. You should be thinking, oh no, all right, I need to go back and make sure that I write that in. And you can always ask for additional paper from the examiner at the front of the hall, the invigilators. Ask them for bits of paper. You just write the question number on there and then add it in, put a little star next to it, and done. Okay? But please write clearly and neatly. The last thing you want is that the examiner can't read your writing. If you can't read your writing, then the examiner probably won't be able to read your writing either. And you might be the smartest and the best geographer out there in the world, but if someone can't read what you're writing, then no one can give you the marks, right? So give yourself the breathing space. Make sure you highlight the keywords, annotate the questions. Make sure you list the geographical terms, on your paper, and take it from there, right? There's no reason why you can't do really, really well this week. Any questions? Let me know now. But if you're watching this afterwards, then you can always post questions in the comments section of the video, which will be available very shortly. And I will try and get back to you guys if you have any questions on there. All right. For those of you who've come tonight, thank you very much. Hopefully this has been somewhat useful, if not completely useful, despite it being a very long session. An hour and a half is a very long time. So hopefully maybe go and take a break now for a little bit. Any questions? If not, I'll give you guys 30 seconds. We shall call it adieu. Okay, good stuff, guys. We will do another session on paper 2 a little bit later on. So Tom, Andrew, Tom, Tate, Dylan, Ollie, if you guys have any questions, just let me know. Just email me directly, or you know where to find me. Thank you, Jin. Just email me, message me. For those of you who I teach, I'm away for the next 2 days, so just bear that in mind. I'm away for a bit, but next week we'll do something on paper 2, and once paper 2 is done, then we'll do a session on paper 3 as well. Right, good luck to everybody, and I'll see you all very soon. Take care.